of these old days, one of these old days, and we won't stop. One of these old days, one of these old days.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Transitions from War podcast. I'm your host, Mike, and this is episode 50, big milestone episode. And today, we're talking once again about reconnecting to mind, body, and spirit. And I have with me a returning guest, Dr. Shauna Springer, or Doc as people know her, who has worked extensively both in the VA and outside of the VA with TAPS, and worked with a lot of Marines. And we've worked together on some retreats. We've worked together in a number of different capacities. So I'm really honored to have Shauna Springer back on this podcast. And Shauna, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Mike. It's good to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you back, too. We are in Studio B once again, which is my Toyota Tacoma. So it's our mobile studio, which is pretty cool.
That works.
It works better than, some public spaces where we have kids running around screaming. So we just finished, a training, and the topic of suicide was one of it's the primary focus of your job. Is that accurate to say?
It is. Right now, it's I'm a senior director of suicide prevention initiatives for Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors, and I've been deeply embedded in the veteran community for the last decade, really focused not only on the battle against hopelessness, but also how our warriors and veterans can transition from the military into meaningful lives after their time in service.
One of the interesting things that shifted the conversation, unlike a typical suicide prevention training, where we talked more like in a fear-based mode about, if somebody has a gun, that's a bad thing. We talked about how a lot of us vets, we own firearms, and we've been trained in how to use them. And so the conversation is a little bit different. And we talked about how having that conversation both professionally or just with people we care about on the outside, for those of us who aren't mental health providers, is tricky because it's such a loaded question, such a loaded conversation.
Yeah, I think it's a very high stakes conversation, and loaded is kind of a word I use in some of the titles for our training on how to have effective, respectful conversations about firearm safety. Even the terminology that we use, guns, firearms, can be distancing. And a lot of civilian mental health providers sometimes have a discomfort around firearms to begin with. So the idea of talking people through firearm safety can be kind of laughable in the context of veterans who own firearms. So really thinking about what firearms mean for veterans, how it connects with their sense of identity, what the removal of a firearm might mean to somebody who has served and owns firearms. These things become really critical to understand at a deeper level.
And we talked about the stories of some people who had completed a suicide and how despite all these things going right in their life and things they valued, how suicide completion still happened. And that when we think of suicide as an option for people who have nothing left or who don't have a specific faith or an afterlife belief or who don't have a family, these myths or stereotypes were cleared up.
Right. Or people who die by suicide always have depression or some kind of mental health challenge that's been ongoing. There is no suicide profile that holds for everyone who dies by suicide. There are different progressions to that, end of that tunnel. And the reason that we at TAPS use our survivor stories in our trainings is to really help people understand that people who die by suicide love their spouses, love their kids. It's very, very complicated. And sometimes they look just like us. Many times they do. And so really understanding at a deeper level, knowing that we're not talking about some other group of people, but people like us that struggle at times when a perfect storm of stress can hit us in our lives.
And the talking with stories and humanizing this is such an important part of it. And I thought of it too, how when I was deployed and people were killed in action, guys I knew, I mean, that was my entire life right there. And I knew who they were, and I knew their circumstances in which they died. And these were many of the biggest moments of my life. And then contrasting that with when I got back, hearing statistics of, or just people, being reported as numbers, which didn't really make it a powerful statement. Like, okay, in other news, 6 people died in Afghanistan today when their convoy is attacked by a roadside bomb, and it's just that's a number. And so we changed it to show like, no, these are real people like us, much more in common with us than apart. It's not some foreign, mysterious person that we can identify with.
Right. I'm actually pretty critical about using statistics in some of the ways that we do. They're helpful in changing policies for sure, but they also can increase people's feelings of helplessness. When we're often saying how many people are dying by suicide, does that move us closer to feeling like we can do something to really intervene, or does that only ramp up our feelings of helplessness? It can do both, in whatever situation we're talking about. But I think we do need to think critically about the role of statistics and what is the real human story behind the statistics.
So in the context for today of talking about what we can do for our battle buddies, our friends, family members who might be at risk for suicide, or might be, well, I don't even know how to frame it other than that. It's tough to even have this conversation. I think that's worth acknowledging, because even talking about suicide is hard. It's not an easy thing to talk about at all.
It's interesting because I know that it's hard on some level, but I talk about it all the time in my work, and in people will often approach me when they know what my line of work is and talk about their internal private struggles so often that I forget that it can be hard for most people to talk about it. And you're very comfortable, talking about this relative to most people. So it's kind of a good reminder for me that this is a challenging subject, and approaching it, I think, needs to be done very strategically, very thoughtfully. The thing that I noticed and still pick up on, whether it's in active duty units, in the veteran community, is this kind of pervasive feeling of helplessness. And I think about the sessions I had when I was at the VA with veterans who had lost a battle buddy to suicide, and how high stakes those sessions were. How the feelings in the room were of survivor guilt. What does it mean for me that I'm still here and he died by suicide? What does that mean for my chances if somebody that strong could take their life? There was a sense of rage with no clear target, sometimes directed at the government, sometimes at the military, sometimes at the spouse, sometimes at the person who died. Doesn't he know that I would have dropped everything and gotten on the next plane if he had told me how bad it was? And so this sense of, what did I miss? How could I have missed that? What does that say about our relationship and our trust? All of that kind of led me to understand that there's this problem of people feeling really helpless, and we're not getting traction with this issue. And I think what I realized is that we need to understand the battle. From a different frame, we need to understand the enemy. So I started kind of moving down that path.
And so we're talking about changing the conversation of how we talk about suicide, and how we talk about talking about it, how we talk about the conversation in general. The thing that is, I think, sticks out to me is that I would be more inclined to avoid it altogether, not talk about it. And I think that silence is so loud, because when it surrounds suicide, or it surrounds a death where it could have been suicide and it's unclear,
Yeah.
What doesn't get talked about, what is on my mind, and I think is on all my friends' minds, is who's next?
Yes,
And
that's right.
And then question our reality, like you said, like if I miss this, if I miss the signs, I was talking to this person and they took their own life, they completed a suicide, then what does it say about my sense of reality or how much I knew them? Or did they not trust me enough to tell me this?
Exactly.
And everything I knew just gets flipped on its head. And so just avoiding the conversation altogether is probably more preferable.
Yeah. And for so many people, that's exactly what I heard over and over again. And Mike, that for, some years now in the late hours of the night, the early morning, I've been working on writing up some of the work I've done over the years, 10 years with veterans around these issues. And so in my book, I use the analogy of the fox in the gut from the boy of Sparta. And the legend goes that the boy of Sparta took a fox and put him inside of his cloak. And he sat in a classroom surrounded by other Spartan students. And the fox began to chew at his stomach. But in that culture of Stoicism where pain was not described or discussed, he sat there until he fell over dead because the fox had eaten out his stomach. And so in plain view of other people, he fell dead. And I think that is an analogy that's very rich for describing exactly what you're talking about. When people feel like they lose a brother or sister in arms, the reality is that many times they feel like they missed the signs or didn't see it coming. And it can feel like they've lost a brother or a sister because of this mysterious sort of sniper that took someone out. And they start to doubt their whole inner wisdom and their ability to navigate these issues. And so you really can't have any sense of control over something that you don't understand, which is why it's so important to understand this issue, I think, from a very different frame and from a tactical frame of how the enemy fights, who the enemy is, and what the predictable patterns are for many who die by suicide.
That sounds like we could be also talking about how war trends shifted from conventional to unconventional. We had to figure out a different way of combating the enemy. We couldn't just say, okay, these are the front lines and we wait for them to come, or we're on the defense or we attack. It was knowing how our enemy operated.
Yes.
And coming up with a completely different strategy for that.
Right. It's not a full frontal assault conventional warfare strategy that's going to work for this issue. It is a very complex form of psychological warfare that our veterans and our service members are trying to fight through this psychological minefield. But if you really think about it, and here's where kind of being an English major was helpful. I was thinking about the stories I was hearing about the end of the tunnel for some people who were feeling really hopeless, and thinking about those campaigns of the enemy. What are the lines of thought? How does the enemy come at you? What does the enemy say to you? What are the sort of predictable campaigns of the enemy? And found a lot of overlap and themes in the stories I was hearing. So started to really put some shape into who the enemy is, how the enemy fights. And then one of my patients said, you should really read the Marine Corps Rifle Squad manual and really get a good understanding of some of how they train us as Marines. So I did. I printed it out. I read it. And it really helped me to understand this from that frame of what are the lessons people learn in terms of tactical understanding and what fits and what doesn't with this frame out.
Marine Corps Rifle Squad manual. How does that play into the conversation of talking about suicide and how we prevent that with our friends?
So I would say that overall that presents a fairly kind of conventional strategy for warfare with formations, and at the same time there's this unconventional piece that can be applied to this battle. I think statements like, a Marine needs to know the enemy, what capabilities he has, what weapons he uses, how he moves in battle. I'm paraphrasing here, but that piece of it, or an isolated Marine can be easily ambushed, again, I'm paraphrasing it, but if we take those concepts and we understand that in this form of psychological warfare, if you get isolated from the tribe of people who can remind you of who you are to them and your value to the tribe and why you are needed and a valued member of the circle, it's much easier to get picked off. And so I think that is, part of what plays out, that people's feelings of hopelessness accrue in silence to the degree that they conceal their hidden pain.
And so just to summarize too, what makes this difficult, especially with vets. So we have a culture that places the completion of the mission or completion of work above personal comfort.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's just a complete code of silence. There's the stoic approach to life, and there's a culture that's familiar with how to use firearms and who is trained to act decisively and engage people with violence when needed. So that filter, or that what would stop most people is less likely to stop anyone who's trained that way.
Exactly. So like we talked about in the training this morning, the analogy that I was using for that was if people have a kind of brake pad and there's a lot of brake pad left in terms of, some people being able to kind of stop themselves from acting on a desire to die, that veterans are trained to, military service members, veterans are trained to act decisively when they perceive a threat. So it's a very dangerous mindset when they see themselves as a threat to their family's future well-being or safety, because there is training that can come into play, especially, if they have immediate access to a very lethal form of self-destruction to move on that idea. So, yeah.
And when we're also talking about the enemy, I think it's worth pointing out that when we talk about the enemy, we're talking about many different things. Like if we're talking, it's not just one thing we're fighting against. Mm-hmm. And you call that a perfect storm of things that come together. Mm-hmm. And so it's usually not just, one thing that's going wrong in someone's life is why they would choose suicide in that moment.
Yeah. The perfect storm is something that it's a TAPS concept developed within my team at TAPS around suicide is never caused by one thing or one individual, but it's a perfect storm of stressors that come together in a very devastating way and can lead somebody to take action. But again, that's not everybody. There's no one suicide profile. So there are others who have a longer path towards hopelessness, who may plan over a number of months or years. And there are others for whom the impulse can arise and kind of come together pretty quickly. And anyone who doubts this, we work with a lot of surviving family members who have lost a loved one to suicide. And in that period after a loss, we're talking about people with no mental health history whatsoever. They are still at elevated risk for suicide just because of the devastating kind of tragic loss of their loved one in a sudden, violent, unpredictable way. So we really have to think more broadly about risk factors and what can lead people to that place of hopelessness.
And going back to the concept of a team or a squad, mm-hmm. we're so used to, especially people who are in the infantry like myself, and really anyone in a unit. I mean, no one gets trained to do solo operations unless, I don't know, maybe some people do. I've never heard of them. But we all are trained from day one that we work together. We're only effective as we are with the whole unit working together. Yeah,
that's right. That's such an important point. I'm so glad you brought that up. So the way that I talk about this is that the true genius of Marines is not in their individual capacity as warfighters.
And it's not for our haircuts.
No, it's not for haircuts.
Horseshoes are the worst haircut I've probably ever seen in my life.
Not for your birth control goggles.
Yeah, those are great too.
Yeah. No, it's in the concerted efforts of those fire teams that learn to work in a way that is implicit. They train to such a degree that they can act in a concerted, coherent way to take out the enemy together. And that's why I get a bit puzzled when people think about this stoicism, the culture of stoicism, and not telling the people that you trust with your life that your life is at risk, that you're being stalked by this hidden enemy who is saying these things to you about who you are as a father, as a person, as a somebody that can make a transition and find a new way to be the warrior that you are after your service.
Yeah, so I wonder too if it's more when we get out of the military, we're spread to all the different parts of the country.
Right.
And what made the connection so powerful is that we're talking, we're face to face, and all the communication is happening. A lot of it is nonverbal, just the way we are around each other.
Yep.
And so the communication now is usually by a group text.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's talking on the phone, but even then, the only cues you're getting, the only information you're getting other than the actual words being said is maybe tone and inflection, how someone's saying something.
Right.
And so we don't have the advantage of being face to face with people. So I can see how this stuff would fall in the gaps, and where something, let's say we're around somebody in my unit and we're there living at the barracks still.
Yep.
We can see, hey man, what's your deal? What's going on?
Yep.
Whereas nobody's going to volunteer, hey guys, I'm feeling kind of down today.
Right. It takes an extra step for people to say, I'm not okay, right? There's so much implicit communication that happens in the service between those that love and trust each other that can't happen without extra effort afterwards. And people are each other's keepers. You know, they notice each other in a different way, but it doesn't mean that they always pick up on suicide risk. This is an important point too, that, you know, the other half of the picture, it's good to learn the signs, but honestly, Marines are really good, and a lot of warfighters are really good at compartmentalizing their pain and concealing their hidden pain. So if you're trying to say, this is on me to look for the signs, and you don't see it and then you feel bad about it, that's only, you know, half the picture. The other half is for people that say that they love their brothers and sisters in arms and trust them to turn to them in all of their battles and say, my head's not right now, and I need you. And that's harder for some people to do than walk into a firefight.
So part of the conversation here, or part of what needs to happen, is giving people that place where they can say that, the vocabulary of, hey, this is what you do when you're pinned down. This is what you do when you need the people in your team or your squad to lay down some suppressing fire because you're stuck.
Yeah, this is how you mobilize the love and trust that you've earned with your brothers and sisters. This is what that looks like. And here is why, if you think about who your fire team is, and it may include your spouse, it may include an extension of your fire team into other relationships, but you have that fire team and they're there for a reason, and you can call on them, and, you know, the trust dictates that you should call on them. Because otherwise, you know, when one of you falls, you all are going to bleed.
That's the thing that we haven't talked about yet, too, is that despite the feeling that people have that I'm a burden and people would be better off without me, from all the experiences I've had and all the experiences you've had, and the research shows that people are so much worse off. And so when we're actually trying to prevent further pain, what we're doing is creating much more pain and despair and destruction in people's lives by completing a suicide. So we get the opposite effect of what we're going for.
Right. So people are so convinced of that when they're in that mind space, when they're in that suicidal mode, they're so convinced that they are a burden and others would be better off. And so that's where they're at. But the reality is, as you said, it's massive collateral damage for those that they love. And so when they're isolated, there's nothing to check that fundamental lie of the suicidal mode. When they can speak up and flush out and reckon with that enemy and the lie there very directly, then they find that people will pour into their lives saying, no, that's not true, and I need you and want you to get help, and this, you know, this doc helped me and it was a game changer for me to get this kind of support, peer support, clinical support, and they come through that, and then they're so glad that they did.
How do you talk to someone about that, though? What are the first things that people can say? When I've been in that place myself, it didn't really feel, it was hard for anyone to convince me that, I was needed in that way. And so it would be hard for me to hear those things.
Yeah.
Or anyone to hear those things, to generalize.
Yeah. I mean, it's variable for each different person. There's different ways to kind of get through to different people. Sometimes reminding them of the old stories that you shared to bring them back to who they are to you and to people in the tribe. Sometimes irreverent, hilarious stories from times that you've served in combat can bring people into a different mind space, get a little bit of room from that kind of thinking. Sometimes sharing your own stories of how you've been in that dark place can help, shake people off of that kind of mindset enough to get them some support. But I kind of go back to earlier in our conversation, we talked about statistics, and statistics can change policies, but stories, whether your own or the old ones that you both shared, these are the things that can kind of help you get in there with people more effectively than just numbers and stats, in my experience anyway.
That sounds right, because, like we're talking about, the numbers and stats, when you're talking to someone directly, it doesn't have that emotional staying power. The way I've looked at these things is, that might be true for them, but that doesn't apply to me. If I own a firearm and maybe there were some signs or I was at elevated risk for suicide, I would still say, no, I'm a Marine. I know how to use a rifle.
That's
I know
right.
how to use a weapon.
Yeah.
I'm not stupid.
Yeah, it's statistics in this kind of a battle are an invitation to deflect. They distance people. This is not a battle that can be fought from a range, way above the battlefield. Like, this is a battle that must be fought in a intensely nuanced psychological way, looking into the whites of someone's eyes.
I don't think we can understand just how people can get there when we're looking from the outside. If I'm watching someone in Ironman, or if I'm watching a basketball game, and I'm like, okay, just hustle a little more. You can get that rebound, but I don't feel tired because I haven't been playing that whole game.
Right.
So in the same way where I was like, well, it's not that bad. Things will change. When you're in it, it doesn't feel like anything will ever change. That cave that is really dark and really deep. Mm-hmm. And so coming at it with that appreciation of what the person feels in that moment can be a lot more powerful than just saying, well, okay, we both live in the same city and things aren't that bad here. Yeah.
That's the essence, I think, of walking with people. I think the other part of it is that, while you want to acknowledge their frame and their experience and their story, we also need to expect them to fight. So we walk with them to understand things from their vantage point, to be willing to tolerate the discomfort of listening to and taking in whatever they need to share about the shape of their hidden pain, to show no shock or fear in response to that, but just to hear it and walk with them. But also, I was going to say, to expect them to fight alongside of us, not to kind of enable them to become dependent, but to say, I hear that. I see why you're feeling that pain. That makes perfect sense for this, that, and the other reason. What are we going to do to fight this? And calling forth within them also that spirit of just not giving up, but persevering in the face of pain in a strategic plan that will get them through it.
Well, that seems to suggest that it takes a certain amount of inner awareness of our own selves as the people who would be on that fire team. Because if we don't know how bad we're doing, or how we're going to react, or how it's going to be when we get that news and sit with it, then we're not really bringing too much to the fight.
Yeah, that's true. And I had an interesting interaction with one of the readers on my blog about a week ago about how, and she was right about how we may not have people in our immediate circle that can offer that to us, and about the importance of persistence in finding the right kinds of support. And it may be somebody we don't know yet, that we haven't met. It may be a mental health provider. It may be a peer. It may be the people we serve within the military. It may be some other source of support, even somebody that we know just for a space of time in our life that isn't there for the long run, but walks with us during a particular period of challenge can be a game changer. So really just holding on to hope and being persistent in finding somebody that can walk with us through that is critical, I think.
What do you think is a good way to approach this as a friend if we're not sure and we're to bring it up?
Yeah, I mean, I think the universal thing is that we all have pain and that it's pretty common that we all try to conceal the extent of our pain. So having more conversations where we tolerate the intimacy of talking about our hidden pain feels an important place to start. I think if you get into a habit of doing that and talking about the things that really matter, not just the things that are comfortable to talk about, then it changes our ability to work together on the things that are not comfortable to talk about, but are very, very important for people's future.
So this is a different type of warfare, and we can use some of the same training and tactics and skills we've learned in the military, but just apply them in this way that it requires us to feel fear, feel sadness, feel uncertainty.
Right. I mean, I was always forever telling my patients that therapy, treatment, it's the harder path to take. If you're sitting in the room and you'd rather not be there, then you're doing the thing you'd rather not do. But that's also the thing that requires more courage, more moral courage to face up with and reckon with the things that are eating you alive, and to do it with people that are worthy of your trust, and to persist sometimes in finding those people that can be part of your fire team. You have to take risks and you have to show a different kind of courage. But with these things in place, I just have seen over and over again how people can find themselves, in that dark place and come through it. They come around the other side of the moon, as some say. And so I know that when somebody's in that space, that there is absolutely hope that won't be forever and that we can work through it together.
One way I think about it now, too, is when I was in Fallujah, I remember there was a healthy level of fear that, oh, wow, good chance I'm going to die here. But then what I realized, there was a much deeper fear, is that the guys I was around with were going to get hurt or killed.
Yep.
And that helped me to do things I would never do, take risks I would never take in order to protect them. And I think as we're talking, that same attitude can be applied, that if I don't want to let down my guys, I'm going to reach out to them.
Yeah.
And I'm going to make sure I don't fail them. And so we can apply this by asking how they are, having conversations that vets or maybe men in general don't have, and understanding that, hey, maybe we feel certain ways that are uncomfortable.
Yeah. I mean, it's not just reach out to your buddies, you owe it to them. It's deeper than that. It is what you said. It's that the things that you would die for are the same things that you can live for when you're trying to hold on to hope. And really making that connection and thinking about what that means in terms of the trust that you hold with your brothers and sisters and your loved ones, it shifts how we think about everything.
Well, I think that's pretty good to go out on.
Okay. Thanks for having me on.
What's one thing you tell people listening who felt something when they listen to that? What's one practical thing someone can do right now?
Go to the person that you love and trust the most in your life and share something that scares you a little bit in the right way. And then get better and better at doing that, so that when the big stuff comes up, you have a pattern of being able to talk about the hard stuff.
I like it. That's great. So thank you, Shauna, for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. It's always fun.
All right, everyone. We'll see you next week. And until then, drink water, meditate, heal bodies.
Good.